Hello, everyone. My name is Stacy Hutchinson. I am the teacher of applied biomechanics as created by Dr. John Hurley in the 1930s and 40s. For information about class details, please see the description box below. Yesterday, these books arrived in the mail. I was excited about this purchase because it is hard to find original copies. It is near impossible to find copies of bioengineering. I bought these books online from a used bookstore in Hollywood, California. There were no pictures, only a description. I took the risk, and I am ecstatic to find book one signed by John Hurley himself, to see this is the first edition printing, and a class list from study group number one. What a gift! I want to read some of my favorite selections from these books. Before I begin, there is a version of the first book that I recommend over all other reprints. Ken Ladd and Shay O'Neill have spent the last several decades exhaustively editing and indexing the first book. When the first book was published, Dr. Hurley was not quite ready, so there is information that is missing that would later be corrected by a pamphlet published to accompany the first book. This information has been added to the book in Ken and Shay's newest edition. I will provide a link to that in the description box as well, along with websites that provide more in-depth information. I hope that you enjoy these readings. This work has fascinated me and has helped my clients for the last 20 years. It is my honor to be able to share this work with the world. This first reading is Chapter 1 from Aquarian-Age Healing For You. It is titled The Human Equation. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Human Equation. The entire practice of medicine or any therapy depends first on correct diagnosis. Any medical doctor will tell you that before any hope of improvement in your trouble can be entertained, a correct diagnosis must be made because treatment is directed by the information thus derived. Just as an illustration, treatment for appendicitis differs greatly from treatment for gallstones, and treatment for gallstones differs greatly from that required in a case of pneumonia. So that successful outcome, as in those cases that recover, depends upon the adoption of the treatment for the true trouble. The treatment for gallstones would be entirely wrong and damage a patient who was in fact suffering from pneumonia or appendicitis. And so it can be seen that a correct diagnosis really is of prime importance. But these diseases are often mistaken, each for the other, and the error is not discovered until and unless death occurs and the body is subjected to an autopsy. This statement would be unbelievable if there were no other grounds for it than the opinion of the authors, but there are other grounds for it, as in the authority of Dr. Cabot of Massachusetts General Hospital, who is probably the highest medical authority in the United States today, and who is professor of internal medicine at Harvard University, one of the best, if not the best medical college in America. He says that of all the cases in that hospital over a period of many years that died and went to autopsy, only 48% were correctly diagnosed. That is, the other 52% were treated for diseases they did not have, and these cases cover all sorts of conditions. Even the commonest and supposedly most easily recognized diseases showed an appalling percentage of errors, indicating that had those mistakes not been made, many of these cases could have been reasonably expected to recover because effective treatment for the disease was well known. This is the performance in the very best hospital with the best of brains and material equipment possible to obtain, and the place where an intensive effort is made and has been consistently made over a long period of time to improve that average, yet almost wholly without changing the original percentages. When following the wrong path, one never arrives at the goal. Reflect for a moment. If this really is true, and we would not dare print it if it were false, if over one half, 52% at our last information, of diagnoses made under the above conditions are wrong, what are the probable percentages in ordinary illnesses where the physician is called upon to take a temperature, feel a pulse, look at a tongue, take in whatever else he can see, ask a few questions, and prescribe a treatment? The mind will automatically reply, "This cannot be so," no matter who makes the statement, because of all the people I know who go to a physician when they get sick, most of them get well, and only those who die could not be saved. The answer to this divides itself into several ideas as follows. First, all the contagious and infectious diseases are described in the textbooks taught in the classrooms and known by experience to be self-limiting diseases. That is, they have a well-defined period of incubation during which the patient is gradually becoming ill. They become sufficiently ill to demand help and attention. They reach a climax of critical period. The patient passes the crisis and dies or recovers. This is the course, and it does not matter at all whether any treatment or none is instituted. The disease will follow this course. A correct diagnosis and a proper treatment will help the patient. Proper methods will assist in passing the crisis and will greatly minimize and sometimes completely control any bad after effects. But no treatment will change the typical history of that disease. Our teaching, being a correction of underlying trouble, does change the history of the disease, and at once. This is the difference. If no error is made by the medical doctor, if everything done from the beginning to the end is exactly adapted to the patient, if a number of those obscure factors which are now beginning to be understood are all used to the best advantage, the patient makes a rapid and complete recovery and is said to have had a light attack, and the doctor gets a little credit. Whereas if the doctor is not so good, fails to recognize the condition at once or its full import, merely treats symptoms as they arise, does not know how to bring into the picture all the reserve and vital forces of the patient at a time when they can be effectively used, but permits these forces to lie dormant and be exhausted by the ravages of the disease, the patient becomes even more ill and recovers, if at all, only after a long struggle and usually with very definite and disastrous after effects. In this case, the doctor is usually credited with being a wonderful fellow, with pulling his patient through a terrible illness, and is credited with a wonderful cure. To all of which he is no more entitled than is the garage man entitled to be regarded as good, who tears your whole automobile apart and returns it to you, a disabled car, when only the carburetor needed adjustment. He may tell you that he put in new pistons, rings, etc., and he may have made a good job of that. But if all of this was unnecessary, he either is no mechanic or he is not working in your interest. He is dealing with a material possession that you can duplicate if you must, whereas the doctor is dealing with your comfort and happiness and that of those around you. Yes, even with your very life. Second, after such diseases have passed, there are, as a rule, sequelae left in their train, and sometimes these are so serious as to be as great a threat against life, and frequently, as just pointed out, almost as great a threat against happiness and effectiveness as the disease itself. This may be seen in the frequent inability to walk after infantile paralysis. No such after effects will ever be left if the disease is properly handled and cleared up. The basis for this statement is found in the experience with methods exactly adapted for the care of such disease, the one we teach, for example, and in the fact that this work will clear the body of all such after effects, even when of years and years of standing. Third, all chronic diseases have their origin in such beginnings, acute diseases incompletely cured. This is a matter not susceptible of complete proof, but the facts are observed so frequently, so uniformly do people under non-medical care report this history, and so uniformly do they respond to the technique herein taught, that we have no fear of successful attack either on the theoretical or practical grounds. The theoretical basis for this statement will appear upon further perusal of this volume. It is in these people, as life approaches and passes the 30th year, that the effects of the aborted and suppressed diseases of childhood, herein discussed, commence to rob the person of comfort and effectiveness. They become unable to carry on as before, are unaccountably tired. They lose the springiness, the elasticity, the drive that they should have, and they attribute their troubles to the immediate symptom most prominent at the time. Constipation usually exists, headaches, neuralgias, more or less pain in the back, legs, abdomen, neck, etc. They take pills, powders, painkillers, and so on. Then they manage to have an operation or two, thus constantly going from bad to worse, until by the time they are 60, they are old, they know it, and they commence to get ready to die. We believe this is entirely wrong, unnecessary, and not at all what should be at the age of 60. We believe it because we see these people change from such states back to full effectiveness, again, under the technique taught, and they do it regularly. This is one of the points of greatest importance in the work we teach, its unfailing results. Now, the next question will be, why is correct diagnosis so difficult? And in this connection, again, we must separate our reply into a number of parts. First, because physiology, that is, the study of functions of the body and its various parts during health, and therefore the first fundamental requirement in recognizing a departure therefrom in disease, is largely unknown or incorrectly known. Here again is a statement unbelievable on our authority alone, because physiology is one of the standard subjects even in the public schools and is taught each day as though it were merely a group of well-known and completely established facts, unchanging and permanent, in spite of the fact that the very next day it may be different because proven untrue. Of course, to some extent, the teaching is true. For instance, the lungs take in and give out air, and during the period the air remains in the lungs, there is an exchange of carbon dioxide for oxygen, and this interchange is necessary to life. But other substances have been found in the air besides oxygen. What does the lung do with these other substances? No physiology states the answer. Additional substances, some in very minute amounts, are found in the atmosphere. Does the body use these? If so, how? No physiology gives the answer. Yet we know, as noted in our chapter on the ductless glands, that dilutions of materials to such a point that the original substances are infinitesimal are activating principles of some of our most necessary functions. For instance, the lack of growth or excessive growth, lack of function or an excess of it, can be traced directly and positively to these minute principles. It is impossible that some of the infinitely dilute or tenuous properties of our atmosphere, just now being discovered or not even discovered yet, may have tremendous effect on our bodies. And if this should prove true, then would not our physiologies again have to be rewritten in the chapters on the function of breathing and all thereto related? Certainly. Exactly this has happened, not especially in relation to the lungs, but in general, is now happening and must continue to happen, for no knowledge is complete on earth today. No truth is absolute, and no science can be completely scientific until all science is complete, and absolute truth is known, and therefore it will be understood that nothing in this work is meant to discredit, destroy, or minimize in any way any of the accomplishments of any school of treatment or healing or any of our scientific advance. But there is another angle as discussed in chapters 13 and 16, which is necessary, however, in order to bring the public mind and the mind of the reader back to the true state of affairs, from which most lay and some professional minds have been deliberately led away by the propaganda of organized political medicine. But now let us go on with our physiology. Einstein is reported to have said something to the effect that weather reports would never be of any real value until a change identical with that which occurred when astrology became astronomy changed meteorology into meteoronomy, ology to onomy, significant endings. We have today physiology, not physiognomy, the result being that changes in fundamental subjects are constantly being made in physiology. We quote from the preface of Kirk's Handbook of Physiology, 21st edition, which is a standard textbook and used in practically every English-speaking school that teaches anything in relation to the care of the sick. It is recognized as an authority and quoted in other standard textbooks. The rapid progress that physiology has made within the last few years has necessitated somewhat extensive alterations in the present edition. The chapters dealing with proteins, blood coagulation, digestion, absorption, respiration, kidney function, and metabolism are almost entirely new. Without the kind of cooperation of so many friends, it would have been impossible for me to have brought out such a complete revision of the book within the short space of time that has elapsed since the last edition was published. In spite of the introduction of such new material, the bulk of the volume has not been materially increased, extensive excisions of what has now become antiquated having also been carried out. In bringing the book up to date, I have endeavored to remember that the main object of the work is to supply students with the elementary textbook, although at the same time my aim has been to make it as complete as possible. The reader will note that when all the chapters on functions listed, and these include all of the vital functions of the body, are almost entirely rewritten, then the reason must have been that there were so many wrong things taught in such chapters previously that it was impossible to merely make corrections. This 21st edition was published before the World War, since which all physiologies were again completely revised due to the additional knowledge gained at that time that had to replace previously erroneous ideas. It is only a few years ago, relatively speaking, since 48 was the total number of chemical elements. Since the atom was adapted as the last division of matter, the indestructible unit, and as the unit upon which all chemistry was based and around which it is organized. Valence, or the attractive power of the atom, was its most peculiar, permanent, and recognizable property, and at that time physiology was in harmony with chemistry. Today, we know that the electron, proton, fields of force must all be comprehended before we can understand the colloid, that no physiology can even approach correctness until we understand colloids, as we are almost nothing else, and colloid chemistry is a new subject. Its developers are the first to admit that the present-day knowledge of these substances is incomplete, inexact, and subject to radical changes. How then can we expect physiology, which deals with the normal functions of groups of colloids, to be dependable? Great advances have been made, and it is today in line with what we now know, that it is best that can be said of it. If we cannot understand what the normal function of the body is, if we do not know just what keeps us alive, how then are we going to detect slight variations or correct gross abnormalities? The schools of treatment, medical or non-medical, are up against this problem. In this teaching, we are not, because we permit the body itself to bring its own healing powers into activity and do nothing else. So long as abnormal conditions exist within the body, just so long will they be discoverable by the methods we lay down, and as our methods certainly and surely make the exact correction most necessary at the moment, we are relieved of the necessity of making any diagnosis whatsoever, except as it becomes desirable to watch the improvement by means of those well-known indications classified under the general term of diagnosis. Second, diagnosis is difficult because it must always depend to some extent, upon the statements the patient or someone familiar with the facts will make. And for numerous reasons, these statements are not always reliable, frequently meant to conceal and almost uniformly directed at the trouble the patient is most concerned about at the moment and not at the underlying trouble. In addition to all this, the medical doctor is in difficulty in selecting treatment because his remedies are colloidal in nature and have their effects upon colloids, the body being largely colloidal. And since colloid chemistry is only in a formative development, the action of his remedies must remain in doubt until the particular patient shows his good or bad response or lack of any. How different and more to be desired the instant change that is experienced under the work we teach herein. To show how exact is the above, we quote from Dr. John V. Shoemaker, author of Materia Medica and Therapeutics, professor of Materia Medica, etc., in the Medico-Chirurgical College and Hospital of Philadelphia. He says, rational medicine is enlightened empiricism, which means that because a certain drug was found effective in certain dosage and combination in a certain disease and patient, it was accepted as a good drug for that disease. Empiricism. The study of that drug so as to observe the effect of its active principle on the tissues involved in that disease led to a certain faint understanding as to why the drug did the things observed. Enlightened empiricism. He goes on to state, rational medicine is an enlightened empiricism which is not based on fixed law, but is progressively improving in proportion with advances in other departments of science. Any practice of medicine assuming to rest upon a foundation less broad than this, or on a system which is fixed and stationary by its own terms, separates itself from scientific medicine and makes its followers a medical sect or school. In the course of centuries, many such schools have been brought to light and after a brief period have been outgrown and forgotten. Such a fate is the natural destiny of any restricted system based upon dogma, Scientific or regular medicine is quite distinct from any school or sect in medicine. Nevertheless, so-called scientific medicine is itself only a school of the same class and sort as the others the doctor refers to, despite his denial. Therefore, as Dr. Shoemaker states, modern medicine has no fixed principle or basis whatsoever upon which to establish any of its conclusions. It just growed up like Topsy. And so we sum up medicine in this brief indication of the material to be found in this chapter by repeating that diagnosis is approximately 50% correct, that diagnosis must be 100% correct before any hope of correct treatment can be held, and that correct treatment is based upon enlightened empiricism without the slightest dogma, that is, without the slightest conception as to what it is all about. No wonder that everyone who consistently relies upon medical care exclusively is finally forced, by constantly increasing dis-ease, to abandon it in favor of one of the drugless methods, the operating table or a graveyard, and in this last alternative they arrive much before the time they should, even accepting, for the sake of argument, the 70 years the Bible allots. The medical doctor recognizes his limitations, but is very slow to admit it. But Jerome Alexander, consulting chemist and chemical engineer, past chairman, Committee of the Chemistry of Colloids, fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Institute of Chemists, member of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, American Institute of Mining and Metallurgical Engineers, etc., states in his book, Colloid Chemistry, 1929, under chemotherapy, "We will never understand just how many remedies work until we trace their effects on the body colloids, a most formidable task. Many remedies operative in vivo do not work in vitro. All diseases are caused by or involve changes in the body colloids which, though delayed by presence of protective substances, are sometimes irreversible. To cure the disease, we must remove the cause and aid the tissues and body fluids, or humors, as they used to be called, to return to their normal state of dispersion and swelling. Bacteria and other invading organisms, as well as the body tissues, have highly scientific absorptive powers, and the shotgun method of try, miss, and try again is our main reliance in finding something that will kill the germ or disease and spare the patient." End quote. He also quotes Sir William Bateson in his address before the British Association for the Advancement of Science as saying, "Every theory of evolution must be such as to accord with the facts of physics and chemistry, a primary necessity to which our predecessors paid small heed. Of the physics and chemistry of life we know next to nothing. Somehow the characters of living things are bound up in properties of colloids and are largely determined by the chemical powers of enzymes. But the study of these classes of matter has only just begun. Living things are found by simple experiment to have powers undreamt of, and who knows what may be behind." Osteopathy was based upon the conception that congestion was the cause of disease. Dr. A.T. Still, the founder of osteopathy, said, "The blood is the life. The reign of the artery is supreme." And osteopathy really embraced the first definite idea and expressed the first definite concept of the first definite method for the correction of disease as distinguished from its treatment. It is now known that the congestion of the osteopath actually exists, that such areas are more highly acid than they should be, or than the immediately adjacent areas, that the capillaries within such areas are closed and remain closed longer than they should, that the mechanism which alternately opens and closes them is out of gear due to this acid accumulation, and that in fact the old-fashioned, once practiced but now generally abandoned osteopathic manipulations undoubtedly did move the congested blood and thereby rest and restore the alkalinity of such areas. Chiropractic was next, with a broad conception. Dr. D.D. Palmer, the discoverer of this work, said concerning it that slightly slipped vertebrae in the human spine produced pressures on nerves emitting from the spinal column on their way from the brain to the tissue cell, thereby shutting off the life forces necessary to the cell to maintain function, and that all disease and the symptoms thereof, including the congestion of the osteopath, were traceable to this cause. It is now known that the loss of mental impulse in the tissue cell, which Dr. Palmer ascribed to the pressure of a bone on the nerve carrying such impulse, does not occur. It is known that the nerve does not come under any considerable compression by any slight slipping of any vertebra on account of the bedding of all such nerves in a protective fatty covering as they emit from the spine and on their passage through the opening. It is also known that the idea Dr. Palmer proposed that the brain converted life forces from the universal forces and supplied each tissue of the body with this force, and that this supply was the total supply that any tissue could have, so that any interference with that supply meant disease and lack of function at the place in proportion where and as the nerve carrying it normally ended, is all erroneous, because the nerve itself, as a transmission line, is incapable of transmitting any such great amounts of force. It does transmit small electrical impulses amounting to 5 to 50 millionths of a volt, according to Dr. Detler W. Bronk at the University of Pennsylvania, which set in motion the power machinery of the cell, tissue, or organ, and without the activating impulse, there is no response. The typical response, however, may be elicited by means of very small electric impulses or by any means of stimulation other than electrical through the nerve, through adjacent tissues, or if directly applied to the tissue itself, as any well-conducted experiment will invariably demonstrate, thus proving erroneous the idea that the evanescent, intangible, almost spiritual thing that Palmer talks about is totally imaginary and is not in any sense the thing it is said to be. This does not mean to say that there is no such universal force, or even that the human brain or body is unadapted or incapable of making such a contact, as Palmer suggests. But it is a purely speculative and philosophical idea that has absolutely no importance in health or disease at the present time, for it has been amply demonstrated that independent tissues, both in or out of the human body, are not connected with any transforming unit, such as Palmer imagines the brain to be, continues to live and thrive just as though they were so connected, an activity which would be totally impossible if Palmer's theory were correct. Amongst those who have experienced the wonderful results sometimes accomplished by the chiropractor, there will be many who will question these statements, because how then could the chiropractor get the results he does? This very question was the one that led to the correct answer, which is that in his attempt to move a vertebra which was slightly out of place, being held there by an abnormal muscular pull, the drive concentrated upon that vertebra is transmitted through that muscle, and the fundamental correction of the sacrum is accidentally and automatically made. This occurs in the successful cases, but frequently fails to occur. This is the reason why, of two identical cases under the same chiropractor at the same time, each receiving his best care, one makes a startling recovery and the other fails to improve. If it happened that the chiropractor adjusted the right vertebra in exactly the right direction, the additional tension instantly thrown upon the already overstrained muscle, which was pulling that vertebra out of its normal position, was frequently great enough to cause the necessary correction of the sacrum in at least that one direction. The vertebra remained adjusted. The patient recovered from that complaint, and everyone concerned believed that it was the movement of the vertebra that produced the result, because the movement of the sacrum, being painless, easy, and noiseless, was completely overshadowed by the directly opposite sense of the vertebra. It might be interesting to some to know that this slipping of the sacrum occurred more frequently under the heavy adjusting on the two-piece table of a few years ago, and explains the reason why there are fewer startling cures made at the present time amongst those using chiropractic or similar methods. Our idea is that this overstretched muscle is also responsible for the acid areas which exist around the congestion of the osteopath. Jerome Alexander states, if anything prevents the capillary from opening again at the proper time, we have a vicious circle, an acid capillary surrounded by acid tissue leading to the congestion or inflammation. But the osteopath of today, having absorbed the teaching of the chiropractors and all other manipulative methods, and having made these teachings part of their own books, have finally abandoned all of it and have become osteopathic physicians and surgeons, which means that they have discarded the conceptions that gave osteopathy its claim to separate method and now favor the enlightened empiricism of the medical profession. The medical people have for many years past and are recognizing more and more the fact that distortion or lack of symmetry of the body plays an important part in disease, because definite types of distortion are always present in each and every disease. But their training is not sufficient along mechanical lines to allow the rapid and intelligent development of this idea. The osteopaths began, and the chiropractors have continued along these lines, but never developed it to its logical conclusion. It took the combined experiences of the osteopaths, coupled with Dr. Hurley's wide and varied experience and knowledge as an engineer, as well as 17 years of continuous practice as a chiropractor, to allow rapid development along these mechanical lines. We have only begun, but this present work is far in advance of anything known before, and you will readily appreciate when you develop the understanding and skill required to practice this method. No one can afford to be ignorant of the facts contained in this book. Our aim is to teach you to measure and understand the presence of weaknesses in the human body that predispose to illness of all kinds. By seeing them and measuring them in advance, we teach you to correct them before serious troubles develop. If the troubles have already developed, the method is still equally effective in restoring the body to normal. This is truly preventative. This concludes Chapter 1 of John Hurley's Aquarian-Age Healing For You, published in 1932 in Los Angeles, California. I hope you enjoyed this reading. I look forward to sharing more chapters with you soon. Please check back often to stay up to date with Hurley's work. See the description box for helpful links. Have a great day.